Well, I want to start by talking a little bit about giving an update on some of the celestial versus animalistic type stuff. So let me give you a heads up on some experiments and playing around that's been done with that since the last time that we talked about it on our calls and such. So it's really, as I think we mentioned before, there seems to be sort of a continuum that stretches from the animalistic or more sort of base experience of PNSE. And again, remember, we don't have any negative views of that. So this isn't a situation where we're like animalistic bad, celestial good, or something like that, right? It's all good. And so remember, the animalistic stuff just relates more to, frankly, more human animal type of things. And when you switch from that to the celestial, very noticeable things go away. And just to give you a little bit of a recap on that, recall there's usually a change in sex drive. There's usually a change in dietary desires and habits. So you do start to want less meat, want more sort of live, raw vegetables and fruits and things like that. A lot of those things that sometimes have been conflated with fundamental well-being are actually probably more than anything related to people thinking the celestial, and the experience of the celestial is sort of where it's at from a fundamental well-being standpoint, which is perfectly fine. People are totally okay to feel like they want a celestial version of the experience. They're totally fine to feel that they want an animalistic feeling of the experience. It doesn't matter one bit. To us, we think it's all fine, all what people want to experience. However, one thing to keep in mind is that we are usually anti-fixation in how we think about these things. And so increasingly over the years, we've seen tremendous benefits from integrating different things and remaining flexible. And so, there's a couple of competing ideas there to some degree. One is that you want to remain fluid across layers and locations and stuff like that so that it can be most appropriate, your system can sort of be most appropriate to the present moment. And that is probably what is most effective in terms of actually living life. Then there's another option, which is really to sort of integrate those layers together. And so if you think about the layers of depth, layer 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever you have access to, you can actually get the simultaneous perception of them. And you can do that in a very pure way, where in every moment, you're really just sort of experiencing the simultaneous perception of them, or you can kind of get a little bit of fluidity in there, such that even though you're experiencing the simultaneous perception of them, you're still maybe having one of those layers be a little bit more dominant percentage-wise in terms of your experience in the moment, and that layer hopefully being a little bit more relevant to what's going on for you in your life, wherever you're at in your environment, whatever's going on in that moment, right? And so a little bit of a hybrid between a purely integrated and a purely flexible type of idea. And you see people doing all of these different things, all of these different options. That hybrid one is not that dissimilar to what you see in location 3 when you've got that meta emotion of love and joy and compassion, and maybe some other ones depending upon your culture. You're not experiencing love and joy and compassion in 33%, 33%, 33%, right? You're basically experiencing at any given time one of those more dominant than the others. And so the integration can show up like that as well. So one of the things that we were doing is we were messing around with integration, and the integration in this case of the 3 pieces of sort of this other axis, the animalistic, the divine, and the celestial. And it really does feel like I don't remember if we talked about this before last time when we were talking about the animalistic and the celestial, but it really does feel like the divine is kind of like a, almost like an illusory hybrid between the two, if you will. And so it seems to be sort of where you can get to in the direction of the celestial before you're actually in and to the celestial. But then once you have access to sort of all three of them, you can combine them and you can integrate them the same way that you can integrate the layers. The way you do that, incidentally, is the same way you would integrate the layers in general, which is just through attention. You know, I don't think anything more powerful than attention when it comes to this process. And so you first want to be able to get a strong, isolated feeling, a strong, isolated experience of each one of these different pieces. You know, most people will automatically have the animalistic because that's where they've spent their entire time pre-PNSE and even in PNSE. And most people that it's very, very rare for people to experience the celestial. So the vast majority of people that experience PNSE, fundamental well-being, they basically are experiencing it through that animalistic lens, sometimes through a blend of that and the divine sort of lens, rarer still through just a divine sort of lens, but almost never through the celestial. The celestial is very, very rare for people to reach, right? And so when you want to integrate in different layers, what you do is you basically really try to isolate yourself to gain a full understanding in your system of a given layer. So if you want to integrate, for instance, the animalistic, the divine, and the celestial, you spend time doing as much as you can at the divine level in terms of just isolating your experience there, letting your system really marinate in it and really understand, okay, this is what a as pure as I can experience version of the divine in my experience feels like. There's big differences between glimpses of things and really letting things settle in to your system. And so you really want to sort of let each one of the things that you want to integrate in settle into your system, right? And so in that case, this would be the divine, and then separately, the celestial. Now, the celestial is not like the most highly functional place. And so, you know, you may want to choose to do that on a vacation, you know, if you've got a busy life or something like that. Because it's, you know, I mean, it's a very interesting spot, right? Where you really feel like you're in a very different density of existence than everyone around you. It feels like sort of everybody else is in a lower plane in a way, and a lower density. Obviously, that's not so great for connecting to people. You know, there's all sorts of sort of downsides to trying to have a highly functional life while being purely rooted in the celestial. And so in order to really marinate in it, you're probably going to need some opportunity to isolate in it for at least a week or two. But this is the path. And so you basically already have the animalistic, virtually everybody. It's the tiniest percentage of people that block the animalistic somehow and either experience the divine or the celestial for the bulk of their life. But that is a vanishingly small number of individuals and unlikely to be you. So most likely you've got a good, solid, full experience of the animalistic layer. You can then work on the divine. You can then work on the celestial. And then once you've got the feeling for each one of those, you start working on the fluidity between them. And fluidity is primarily accomplished, as we've said many times regarding locations and levels, both down to attention. It's down to remembering what another experience feels like in your system, the experience of the divine or the experience of the celestial, or if you're out of the animalistic at the moment, the experience of the animalistic, whatever. So you basically call up as much of a memory of that. But when I say memory, I don't mean a mental memory or a cognitive based memory. I'm talking about a memory that is like as full an expression in your experience as you possibly can. And you put your attention on that. And generally that's how you bring these different things more to the foreground of your experience. And so if you're primarily centered in the divine, you want to go back to the animalistic, you do this with the animalistic. You bring it up in your system as much as you possibly can. You put your attention on it, you keep your attention on it until it is rooted in as sort of your dominant experience in the moment. So your next step after getting the individual flavors down is to then figure out and practice how to make this fluidity attention thing work for you to the greatest extent you can and get this fluidity piece down. Once you've got the fluidity piece down, what you've done is you've actually spent a lot of time practicing how each one of these feel when you are not in them. And that's very useful. What you can then start to do is integrate them either 2 or 3 at a time. If you're kind of a master integrator, you can do 3 at a time. If you're just sort of learning or getting started with integration, you can just do a couple at a time. And so you're going to be in one. You then call up the other one and you put your attention on it, but you basically allow it to draw into the point where it's, about at the 50% point of you being pulled into it. And then you split your attention to both of them, right? And you put your attention on both of them simultaneously. And your system will learn, the more you do this, to hold both of them in experience simultaneously. And the more that you do that, the more it will habituate and come together and just naturally happen. And you will have an integration process that happens such that you can even reach a point where it's actually very, very difficult to pull them apart again. You can really get your perceptual system to just merge these things in as kind of a new habit that it's got, so that it's all together. So you would do that with all 3 of them, obviously, if you wanted to do the animalistic, the divine, and the celestial. And I can tell you that when you do that, it's one of the most remarkable experiences that I think anyone can have. We talk about and we think about how amazing location 3 is. And if you've ever really deepened in to location 3, layer 3, sort of the furthest reaches of location 3, really solidly grounded deep in the 3rd layer of depth that is the home of sort of the most mature form of location 3. I mean, that is an unbelievable experience. We've got so much psychological data that just, it's like location 1, location 2, location 3 deep in, location 4, location 5, right? In terms of these richly experienced psychological traits that people just love to have as part of their experience. It's not hard to see why that has earned its reputation over time as sort of the place that people want for the maximum feeling of good humanness, right? Before you sort of go beyond humanness in the later locations. As great as that is, this is better. Right? So when you really get this mix of the divine and the animalistic and the celestial all at once in an integrated way, it really truly feels even more amazing. You can imagine what happens then if you slide that in to location 3. It goes off the charts even more, right? And so one of the reasons to experience this is just because it's such a phenomenal way of experiencing life. And it's not, like it's not location 1 in terms of its ability to interface with other people in the world and whatever else, but it's pretty good. It's also, it's a long way from being stuck in the celestial or the further reaches of the divine or something like that. It is still a quite functional place, and it's a quite functional place that feels amazing. And so if you've got access to some of these things, you can start to experiment with them. One thing to think about in terms of, you're right on time, Patrick, with your question. One of the things to think about in relation to the celestial and the divine is that the divine seems to be sort of like a dirtier, lower vibration version of the celestial. And so When you get past a certain point, of course, the divine disappears. And if you spend a lot of time past it, and you really deepen in to even just location 4, frankly, it's fine. But location 4 or later, after a while, you're able to really see and understand the mechanisms that create the divine in your psyche. And once you see that, for some people, it can be very, very hard for them to take the divine seriously or as real again, because they sort of feel like they've seen behind the curtain. And as a consequence of that, it's sort of like, well, now I know that was never real. Now I see what combines to form the feeling of the divine. And sometimes that can cause issues for them if they decide to be fluid and go back to earlier locations. And it can give them cognitive dissonance, especially if the feeling of the divine returns to them. And they can feel like, oh, well, that's just an illusionary thing. I shouldn't give that any attention, or whatever else. And so this divine thing is very interesting. Let me go one step further in this integration piece before we talk too much more about that. But when you, as you're holding the three things sort of together into sort of a unified perceptual lens, if you will. By that, I mean the animalistic, the divine, and the celestial. After a while, especially I think if you have access to deeper locations, a more profound deconditioning process can occur. And sometimes this can be very rapid. It doesn't have to be something that unfolds for years or months or anything like that. And when that deconditioning process happens, there's a coming together of the animalistic and the celestial into something new. And notice what I'm not saying is included in that, even though perception was and felt like it was an integration of the animalistic, the divine, and the celestial. The divine is essentially left out of this. It's like it's back to its non-existence, never existed, is just an illusionary type of thing. And you can actually feel the celestial merging in with the animalistic inside sort of your own subjective experience. You can feel this merger or this union happening. And when it happens, it leaves behind an amalgam that is entirely new and different than anything that came before it. And it brings with it a very significant change. And so one way that I think about the animalistic and the celestial and the divine is sort of as, if you think about a coin, and a coin has two sides. And so let's say the animalistic is one side and the celestial is the other side. But then there's also a rim around the coin where, if you think about a US coin, for instance, there's often like zinc and copper, or, two different things that come together. And if you look at the side of the coin, you can see where they come together. It's almost like that boundary layer where they're coming together is creating this sense of a divine. But it's, it's really just, it's not necessarily real per se. It's more like it's a boundary layer that's being perceived. And when this amalgam is created, if you imagine then that coin melting down and those metals basically combining into some new metal, that would be a good analogy for sort of the amalgam that's created here. You really lose access to anything that feels like the animalistic or anything that feels like the celestial. And it's a much more even more normal feeling version of experience that comes in that has come in before. Oftentimes when we're talking about stuff at like, layer 4 or in late locations or something, and people will think it just sounds so incredibly mystical. And, when you're experiencing it, there's nothing mystical about it. You're literally just describing your direct experience of reality. This is just like that. It is, except that it's almost like that to an entirely new level or degree. And one of the things that you notice is that prior to this, let's say you're in location 4, 5, 6, 7, wherever, some sort of later location. One of the things that we've talked about in those locations is you have a flatness of your perceptual experience that shows up there. I mean, people even call it things like the flatness of the absolute and things like that, right? And so it really does just feel flat. Now, if you don't ever come back from these later locations, you probably never pick up on how flat your perceptual experience has gotten. But if you do come back, suddenly there's like a dimensionality to experience that wasn't there before. And you're like, whoa, you know, how did that slip its way in there? And I didn't even realize it was slipping its way in there. So that's a really common report that happens to people who go to later locations and come back to earlier ones, and maybe become fluid in later locations between, say, 7 and 5 or something like that, or especially if they, you know, really come back to 4 or before. Again, it's hard to get back past that chasm between 4 and 5. So usually when fluidity is reached in those later locations, it's reached between like 5 and 7, sometimes 8. So if we think about this, the flatness goes away when this amalgam happens. And even though, you know, you can tell if you just go through the check marks of how you're experiencing the world that you're now definitely in a late location. Strangely, the world is highly dimensional. Again, it's almost like as you go into late locations, fixated on one side of the coin or the other, because it happens to people that are on the animalistic side, and it happens to people that are on the celestial side of those later locations, that it just gets flatter and flatter and flatter and flatter and flatter. Doesn't matter, it seemed to matter which side of the coin their experience is primarily rooted in. With this amalgamation of the two, with not being fixated really in either two, but also not even just having simultaneous perception of either two, having these two sort of collapse, if you will, if you think about it, another way to think about this is that there's a lot of false dualities in the system that are transcended as you go deeper and deeper into fundamental well-being. And so it's very likely that the animalistic is a false duality with the celestial, as an example, right? And so another way to think about this amalgamation is kind of the collapse of them, right? That merger could easily be thought of as a dissolving as well. And so what's left in its wake is a far more integrated late location state, essentially. And so anyway, I just wanted to take a little bit of time, the first part of our Q&A today, and kind of finish on the animalistic and celestial stuff. I wanted to leave it out there so that you could, you know, get familiar with it, play with it, all of that for a while. But now I want to sort of come back and add these layers and this additional information to it.